All right, today we're digging into a pretty provocative document. It's called the Whitewash Protocol, and it makes a really explosive claim that a tragic shooting in Washington, D.C. was absolutely not what it seemed. We're going to walk through the author's argument step by step, looking at the exact evidence they lay out in their analysis. So let's just get right into it. This right here, this is the single claim the entire theory is built on. The author just comes right out of the gate pointing to this major timeline problem. A government crackdown was apparently signed and authorized 5 full days before the shooting that it was supposedly a response to. This is the foundation for everything we're about to look at. So how in the world does the author build this case? Well, their argument really unfolds in 5 key parts. We're going to start with the official story, what we were all told. Then we'll dive into what they call the pre-crime paradox. From there, we'll examine the shooter's profile, the supposed motive behind this whitewash agenda, and finally, we'll look at a statistical argument they call an impossible coincidence. Okay, first up, the official story. Before we can really get into the author's claims, we have to establish the baseline, right? The commonly accepted narrative of what happened on that day in D.C. The story we all heard is pretty straightforward. It was a tragic lone wolf attack. According to this narrative, an Afghan refugee who had become radicalized opened fire on National Guard troops. This incredibly violent act then triggered a necessary and swift government response to make sure the country was safe. That's our baseline. And this is where we get to the author's first major challenge to that official story. They pull out this key piece of evidence, a memo they actually call the smoking gun, that creates what they've termed the pre-crime paradox. Here it is. This is the core problem the author points to. On Friday, November 21st, a memo gets signed that freezes green cards for refugees. 5 days later, the shooting happens. And then, the very next day, that shooting is used as the public reason for the memo, the one that was already signed. According to the author, the timeline is completely backward. The effect came before the cause. This really is the paradox in a nutshell. I mean, normally you have a cause, a crime, that leads to an effect, a government response. Simple cause and effect. But what the source alleges here is the complete reverse. The effect, that response memo, actually came first, and then a cause, what they call a scripted crime, was needed to justify it to the public. So, if we follow the author's timeline, the next logical question has to be about the shooter, right? Rahmanullah Khanwal. The source argues that he wasn't just some random radicalized person. No, they claim he was a very specific asset, chosen for this exact role. And the author really reframes the whole story just by asking this one question. It shifts the entire focus from a lone wolf to a man with a very, very specific past. The author presents 3 really crucial points about Lakhanwal's background. First, they allege he was a member of a CIA-trained paramilitary unit in Afghanistan. Second, his asylum application was actually fast-tracked by the very same administration he supposedly attacked. And third, and this is a big one, his own green card was one of the ones frozen by that November 21st memo, which, in the author's view, created the perfect leverage over him. Then, the source lays out this alleged sequence of events that happened inside that 120-hour window. It claims the memo created the leverage, a sum of money suddenly appears, and then Lakhanwal attacks the one specific National Guard unit that a federal judge had just declared illegal only days before, on the very same day that memo was signed. Okay, so the analysis has laid out a how, right? This inverted timeline and a very specific asset. But that leaves the biggest question of all. Why? Why would anyone do this? The author tries to answer that by outlining what they see as a much larger motive, which they call the whitewash agenda. According to this source, the ultimate goal wasn't about national security at all. It was something the author labels demographic engineering. And they define this as staging an event in order to link all immigration with terrorism, which would then create the political cover needed for mass removals and a total stop to immigration from non-white countries. And to back up this claim, the author draws what is a pretty chilling historical parallel. They argue that the modern rhetoric you hear about a Southern invasion is a direct echo of the language used back in the 19th century to justify the removal of Native American populations, framing both as this existential threat to a white nation. So, the final piece of the author's argument shifts gears from motive to pure math. They basically claim that for the official story to hold up, you have to believe in a series of coincidences that are so incredibly unlikely, they border on being statistically impossible. First, there's the coincidence of timing. The author asks, what are the actual odds that a random attack would just happen to occur in the exact 5-day window after a secret memo was signed that needed exactly this kind of event to justify it? Their calculation, less than 0.01%. Second, the coincidence of the target. I mean, what are the chances that this same attacker would just randomly pick the one specific military unit that a judge had declared illegal just 120 hours earlier? Again, the source puts that probability at less than 0.01%. And third, the coincidence of the shooter himself. What's the probability that the attacker just happens to be a former CIA-trained operative whose entry into the country was personally fast-tracked by the administration he then attacked? Once again, less than 0.01%. So when you combine these three independent probabilities, the timing, the target, and the shooter's identity, the author reaches their mathematical conclusion. And it's pretty blunt. The chance of all of this happening randomly is, for all practical purposes, 0. And so, to just wrap up the theory presented in the Whitewash Protocol, the author argues the Edlow memo is proof of premeditation. They say Lochinwall's history as a zero-unit member proves the event was engineered. The broader agenda of demographic engineering provides the motive, and the shooter himself, well, he wasn't a terrorist. He was a Trojan horse. And that really brings us to the final question this whole analysis leaves us with. It presents a choice between two very different narratives. Are we looking at a meticulously engineered plot, or just a string of coincidences so improbable that the author calculates them as virtually impossible? The sources laid out its case, and the conclusion? Well, that's left for you to decide.